Good evening. Welcome to the QCIS channel. On this channel, you get a daily dose of science, technology, engineering, and math. My name is Leon Jones, and this evening, I'm going to discuss change orders. Again, I'm going to discuss change orders. Now, if you are in the construction industry, or if you're a consultant trying to bid work, and let's say you have a agency that you're working for, you might do some extra work that wasn't in the original contract. So what happens? You're going to have to try to get more funding for the extra work you have to do. And the only way you are going to be able to do that is by way of a change order. Now, one must understand when we deal with change orders, there's a process. Now, I work in the construction industry, and change orders are not uncommon. Why? Because there are different items that take place. I'll give you an example. When you bid quantity and you use more quantity than you bid, you have an overrun. So you have to be able to justify why you need change orders or a change order to get more monies for additional quantity. Well, that's all in your narrative. See, when you write a change order, you're going to write exactly what you need to change order for. Example, again, for an overrun. According to the contract, we had a bid of 1,200 square yards. Well, after the work was completed, we had 34 square yards. However, 12 square yards were bid for the contract. So in addition to the 12 yards that were bid, I am writing this change order for funding for the extra 22 yards. When I say yards, I mean square yards. Now, when you deal with a change order, just like I told you yesterday about an inspector's daily report, who, what, when, how, why, and where. So a question that you have to ask when you do any type of change order, particularly for construction, is there going to be a time extension? Where or what location was the work completed? How was it completed? Because I know on some transportation projects, you have something called a force account, which is a change order. But now a force account, it can get you into all types of headaches because you have to verify every bolt, every broom, everything, because that's going to be converted into a change order. Now, most of us do not like doing force accounts because then you have to account for of your equipment. Was it in standby? Was it running? Mobilization, demobilization. Basically, when we deal with a change order, we're changing the scope of work. And generally, when we change the scope of the work, we are adding more monies or funding to the original contract for the additional work. There are different clauses that you put in change orders, like a design error or errors and omissions, unforeseen field conditions. You may be out in the field and you're excavating for an old pipe, and you find out that that old pipe wasn't there, and you come up to an old tank that was a gas station. Well, that's an unforeseen field condition. And in that, you're going to have to send an environmental team out there to make sure that the soil under that tank is not is basically saturated with pollutants. Be a problem. But dealing with change orders, sometimes change orders can allow you to move funding from one item to another because, as I said before, most of the time, change orders will change the scope of the contract by adding funding to the original contract. And going back to the soil situation, if you ever find an environmental factor like a tank after you're looking for a pipe and you put a change order, and then you have to deal with HAZWOPER, then have to make sure that that soil is not contaminated. And that will also be part of the change order. Now, going back to the change order, as I was stating, most of the time the change orders will change the amount of the contract. Now, here's an exception that will not change the scope of the contract. And that is if you have an item. Now, let me show you what I mean by items here. All right. In this sheet, see this sheet. These are what you call items in the contract. Now, contractors bid material that they believe they're going to use in the contract. However, some items don't get used. Now, when items don't get used at the end of a project, here's one change order that doesn't change the original contract. It's called a balancing and overrun change order. What are you really doing? We are basically taking the overruns, any underruns, to zero everything out. That's what you do in accounting. Now, another way that the contract doesn't change is if I have an unused item and I have an item that I'm using, but I have an overrun for this item that I'm using. What I can do is submit a change order to transfer funds from the item that I didn't use over to the funds that I did use. Now, I do prefer that type of change order because you don't, number one, you don't change the amount of the original contract. All you're doing is moving funds around. And number two, all of the monies within that contract, you're basically saving some money too. Why? Because you're not asking for additional funding. Now, another way, a change order can be used. Now, what if you have material that you need, but that material is not in the contract? Now, what you do, particularly if you're on a Department of Transportation project, you're going to go to 3 districts that have used that particular item. Because there's sometimes you're going to have an item that you're going to have to add to the contract. Now, you can add an item to the contract and transfer funds from an item that you haven't used to the new item, and that does not change the amount of the original contract, or you can ask for additional funding. Now, I will say this when it comes to a change order. Every project is going to have a change order. If you don't have any change orders, your project is either very, very small or you have a complete project. Now, Very rarely have I run into, and I'm not saying they don't exist, but most of the time you're going to have some change orders. Now, let me share my screen and let's get into the basics of a change order. And I will leave the link at the bottom of my comment section in the video. Now, when we deal with change orders, most of the time we deal with them in construction. Now, the term change order is ubiquitous in the construction industry, but you're unlikely to have come across it anywhere else. So, as a new practitioner, having a good handle on change orders is important. Why? Because it is the rare case indeed where the parties won't have at least one disputed change order. Now, the information that I'm going to give you right now, I'm going to discuss the basic definition of a change order, changes in the work clauses, and a legal basis for change orders, and of course, a few pointers for handling change order disputes. Now, first of all, when we get into change orders, one must ask, what is a change order? Well, again, a change order is just the industry term for an amendment to a construction contract that changes, I just mentioned it, the scope of work. Now, for the most part, if you've had experience in change orders, basically change orders modify the work required by the construction documents, which in turn, as I stated before, usually increases the contract price or it adjusts the amount of time the contractor has to complete the work or both. Now, for there to be a valid change order, the owner and contractor must agree on the terms. So basically, classic examples of change orders include the owner's desire to move the location of a wall to accommodate some other design element, adding a window where there was none in the original plans, or changing the finish of the floors from tile to terrazzo. Now, these types of change orders are known as additive change orders, but there are also change orders which delete portions of the work. These are known as deductive change orders and typically result in a decrease in contract price. Now, basically, you don't see a lot of those. Most of your change orders always add to work because contractors, and I'll be honest with you, contractors might make 3% on the project. So the more change orders that they have, it's better for them to make money. Again, must understand that the contractors are there to make money. Now, change orders exist because of the dynamic and complex nature of construction projects for most projects. Why? Because it's simply not possible to anticipate every challenge or variable from the outset, mistakes or ambiguities in the plans. The owner's desire to make aesthetic changes to the project and the owner's need to reduce costs can all be addressed by means of a change order. Now, changes in the work clauses. Again, I'm dealing with construction here, so most all contracts have changes in the work. The work clause that establishes procedures for revising a contractor's scope of work. Now, a changes in the work clause is an essential part of any construction contract because it allows the parties to agree in advance to a process for making changes to the work and pricing those changes. So basically, all major standard form agreements address changes in the work. They're basically usually part of the general conditions. For instance, in the AIA, which AIA stands for the American Institute of Architects. So from the AIA-A201 2017 changes are addressed in Article 7, while in the AGC Consensus Docs 200 AGC, which I believe it's the American Society for General Contractors. And those provisions are found in Article 8. Now, the standard form agreements will assume change orders will be written documents. And basically, custom contracts often explicitly state there can be no oral modification of the contract, and only signed written change orders will be binding on all parties. Now, the process for agreeing to a change order begins when one of the parties to a contract requests a change to the agreement. So basically, the contractor prepares a change order proposal, and the contractor basically quotes a price for extra work. Now, once the owner and contractor agree on the scope, price, and they schedule a formal written change order will be prepared and signed by all parties. Then the contractor proceeds to fulfill or perform the change work. Now, at least that's the way it's supposed to go. Now, under field conditions where the need for changes in the work can suddenly arise, there's constant pressure to keep the schedule. The standard process isn't always followed, and change orders aren't necessarily reduced to writing. So basically, all those changes are still binding on the parties. Now, in most cases, and yes, even if the parties don't follow their own contractual procedures for making changes, they can still bind themselves to change orders, to words, or conduct which waive the changes in the work clause. So, for instance, if the contractor requires written signed change orders, but the engineer in the field directs the contractor to make a change in the work with the understanding that the parties will set fair prices later, the owner won't be able to deny paying for the change just because it isn't in writing. Now, when we deal with change orders, we have what we call CCDs. They're construction change directives. So I'm just going to say this. Change orders are not the only way for the owner to change the work. Most contracts also allow the owner to unilaterally change the work without agreeing or agreement from the contractor through a construction change directive or CCD. Now, remember, issuing a change order depends on the agreement between the owner and the contractor as to scope, price, and time. So when the parties cannot agree, even if the contractor doesn't know how much it'll be paid for the extra work, under the AIA form contracts, the additional compensation of completion due, and that's the completion time, and that's due for the CCD will be determined by the architect instead of by agreement of the parties. Now, if the contractor disagrees, it can make a claim against the owner under the contract or just sue. So what the contractor can't do, unfortunately, is to refuse to perform the work. So basically, any failure to carry out the work of a construction change directive is a breach of contract. And there are laws when we deal with contracts. Now, the value of a CCD from the owner's perspective is that it minimizes delays and allows the work to proceed, even if the parties can't agree about the additional time or money. But enforcing a construction change directive against the contractor seemingly conflicts with the traditional common law rule. The modifications to contract must be mutual and supported by consideration. Nonetheless, courts routinely enforce CCD provisions. Moving on to the cardinal change doctrine. Now, while an owner's authority to require changes in the work is broad, it's not unlimited. The cardinal change doctrine protects contractors from overreach. Simply put, the cardinal change doctrine holds that some changes in the work so fundamentally alter the original obligation undertaken by the contractor that it would be a breach of contract if the owner, or by the owner, if the owner insisted the contractor perform the work. Now, this is important. The cardinal change doctrine holds that some changes in the work fundamentally can alter the original obligation undertaken by the contractor, that it would breach the contractor, that it would breach the contract by the owner if the owner insisted the contractor did perform the work. Now, to illustrate, if an owner and contractor entered into an agreement for the construction of a hotel, but the owner later decided to build a movie theater instead, the cardinal change doctrine would relieve the contractor from building a movie theater, even if there was an otherwise valid CCD directing the contractor to build the theater. Now, the cardinal change doctrine can also be involved if the totality of the change orders on the project results in a fundamental change to the original work. Therefore, it's important to be mindful of the entire scope of the project and the change orders issued to date when evaluating the client's position. Now, I'm going to show you an example of a change order that I did, but tips for change order disputes. Again, change orders can create a lot of work for construction lawyers. So owners and contractors can never seem to agree on whether something is a change, which again costs more money, or part of the original contract scope and included in the original price. So I'm just going to say this. The next time you are litigating a change order dispute, keep these tips in mind. Figuring out whether a change order is justified is fact specific. So to determine whether a change is really a change, look at the pre-bid documents responses to RFIs. If you don't know what an RFI is, I will get into that later. An RFI is request for information. Got to look for field work orders and the parties' course of dealing. Again, figuring out whether a change order is justified is fact specific. So to determine whether a change is really a change, look at the pre-bid documents. Look at the responses to RFIs, field work orders, and the parties' course of dealing. Also consider order of precedence clauses, which determine whether written specifications or drawings control. Again, contractors often proceed with extra work without first securing a written change order. So if the contractor does not have a written change order or CCD, consider whether the parties may have waived the requirement through their words or actions. Again, understand this. A change to one contract does not necessarily change another. So if the owner and the contractor execute a change order, but the contractor fails to obtain a change order from its subcontractor, there may be a gap in the scope of work. So if you're a contractor, be sure subcontractor clients get the change orders that they deserve. Now again, overall, the change order is a fundamental concept in the construction industry because it gives owners and contractors flexibility to address the unexpected, like expected field conditions. But the flexibility does come at a cost, often in the form of attorney's fees. That's if you start to get into the claims. Basically, most of them don't, particularly on the smaller projects. Bigger projects where you have a lot more hands in the pot, yes. Now, you can help minimize the cost by advising clients to be sure they get the detailed written change orders, and if anything else, document everything if a dispute rolls around. And if you're on a construction project, you're going to be happy that you did do exactly what is stated here with this information that I have provided you. Now, what I'm going to do is show you one of my change orders. Now, here's a change order, and this is a real live change order that I did when I worked for the DNR, the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. Now, I actually created all this myself. Now, with the change order, created a project number. Now, this one's for the Crosley Dam. And you got to have a description of the project. Here's what I came up with. Based on the discussions today and the scenic construction delay and completion date of May 24th, 2020, and their request for change order number one is to add 201 days to their contract. We respectively request additional time and budget for inspection for the Crosley Dam improvements. And when I wrote this up, I gave you where we are. To date, we have now incurred 98% of our budget for construction. CE inspection, which includes the $10,000 additional allowance for construction. So based on our project rate of expenses and fees to be incurred to reach the new completion date of December 11th, 2020, we will need to increase our fee budget by $40,000. Also, we request that our completion date for the project be extended to December 31st, 2021 to reach 1 year after the contractor's completion for warranty issues. We also understand that the budget may not be processed until July 2020, but we will be able to continue to provide inspection services in good faith, not to jeopardize the construction completion date now established. Now, this change order was actually written for additional inspection services. Now, what I have here is I have listed the institution and department. The actual consultant's name is Commonwealth Engineers. Gave me a federal ID number. I had to look all this up on the internet. And of course, the project manager. And then the construction period in calendar days. I had to figure all that out. Also the designer name, Commonwealth Engineering. And then some change orders require a purchase order number. Had to get that from a spreadsheet. Then here's the original contract amount. Now, total previous amendment value. It's zero because I didn't have any amendments before this change order. So this is where I get the pre-amendment contract value, which is now the value of the contract. It still is $205,000. Now, what I'm going to be doing is increasing the contract by $40,000, which will give me a new amount of $245,000. Also, I'm given additional days at 201 and a new project completion date. And that's what you do with the change order. Give you an example of one of my change orders. Now, again, most jobs will have change orders. Just make sure you're straight to the point when you write a change order and use documentation to justify why you need the change order. So make sure you know what you're talking about, such as if there was a design error, unforeseen field condition, overruns, you have an item that's not in the contract. Those are examples. Basically, for the most part, change orders are usually there to either add additional work or modify the work. Basically, when it comes to construction projects, most construction projects will have change orders. And what I'll do, I'll leave the information that I've given you tonight in my comment section. So if you're in the field of construction or design or architecture, the information that I'm providing you is a great way to understand change orders. And that concludes this topic on change orders. If you like what I just presented, please comment, share, and subscribe. And if you are looking for some social, political, and news content, check out my main channel, the 411 Talk Zone Radio Show channel. Now, if you can't find the 411 Talk Zone Radio Show channel or the QCIS channel on YouTube, you can find both of those channels out on Twitter. So after I do every video on YouTube, I do post it on Twitter. Now for the QCIS channel, since it's an educational channel, I take it one step further. Find the QCIS channel on my LinkedIn page. Once again, thank you for viewing this content, change order from the QCIS channel. On this channel, you get a daily dose of science, technology, engineering, and math. Till next time, my name is Leon Jones. I want you all to have a wonderful and gracious evening.